Hello, my name is Alyssa Lucadamo, and this presentation is part of my digital evidence portfolio for Wilmington University's Gifted and Talented Practicum course. This presentation focuses on the National Association for Gifted Children, CEC, Teacher Knowledge and Skill Standards for Gifted and Talented Education, specifically Standard 1, Learner Development and Individual Learning Differences. I'd like to begin by providing some educational context. To demonstrate my progress toward meeting Standard 1, I will be showing you a differentiated lesson plan and assessments that I created to address the topic of irony in my 8th grade English Language Arts classroom. Irony is a major concept in our 8th grade curriculum, and it is a topic that causes difficulty for students every year. However, the Common Core State Standards address irony indirectly in Standard RL 8.4 and explicitly in RL 8.6. If my students are to determine the effect of word choice on tone, they will need to be able to recognize a sarcastic tone in context. Additionally, they will need to be able to identify situational and dramatic irony and explain their effect on the reader or audience. By creating the differentiated lesson, I am demonstrating that I have at least partially met the requirements of Standard 1. Some potential problems that arise out of my students' cognitive and affective differences are listed on this slide. When describing social information processing theory, Moon points out that correctly interpreting social cues, like the use of sarcasm, may be difficult for some students and result in an inappropriate response. Thus, the need for understanding irony has real-world applications as students are making friends and navigating social situations. Additionally, differences in cognitive development and prior experiences result in different readiness levels. For example, some students may have the benefit of an older sibling or a parent who uses lots of verbal irony in social context. These students would be primed to pick up on the use of verbal irony in text, whereas their peers who don't share that same experience would not. To address these problems, I came up with a solution process. I developed formative and summative assessment tools to gauge my students' mastery of the standards, developed a differentiated lesson plan to teach the concept of irony, implemented the lesson with students, and gathered assessment data to review and reflect on the effectiveness of my instruction and assessments. The pre-assessment was a brief multiple-choice quiz which gave students short scenarios to read. After reading each scenario, students had to choose the answer that correctly identifies the type of irony being used and the correct explanation for why the scenario was ironic. In my largest class of 33 students, 5 students failed the pre-assessment. Beginning with a pre-assessment allowed me to get a clear picture of my students' learning differences. Knowing that my students would need to approach the concept of irony through various entry points, I created the differentiated lesson. All the students received the same initial instruction on the different types of irony through animated videos. TED Ed is a great source for such materials, like the example shown here by Christopher Warner on situational irony. Students who scored low on the pre-assessment viewed another video, Bert and Ernie's Gift of the Magi, from the television show Sesame Street. They also completed a graphic organizer guiding them to identify irony in the video. Students who scored higher on the pre-assessment read Us and Them, a short story by David Sedaris. All students had access to additional resources and activities related to irony on Schoology, an online learning management system similar to Blackboard. I was able to use my background knowledge about my students' learning styles and preferences to create the differentiated lesson. The Schoology resources include traditional text definitions and examples of the types of irony, a webcomic and videos for visual learners, and examples of irony in pop culture. For students who are interpersonal learners, I created an irony discussion board where students viewed ironic signs and discussed what made them ironic. Finally, after instruction, I administered a post-test to measure the progress my students made toward mastering the concept of irony. It was very similar in format to the pre-assessment. In that same class of 33 students, just one student failed the post-assessment. However, this student did improve his score from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment, which indicates that his understanding of irony is increasing, albeit at a slower pace than some of his classmates. Now I'd like to move on and discuss the relationship between my differentiated lesson and Standard 1. Standard 1 is broken into 2 substandards. The first states that beginning gifted education professionals understand the variations in learning and development in cognitive and affective areas between and among individuals with gifts and talents, and apply this understanding to provide meaningful and challenging learning experiences for individuals with exceptionalities. My differentiated lesson demonstrates my progress toward meeting this standard in several ways. First, I used pre-assessment data to group my students for instruction. I recognized that irony may be more difficult to master for some students than for others, and I wanted to accommodate those differences. Instruction was differentiated to meet students' needs. Based on the data I gathered from the pre-assessment, I was able to determine which students needed to be exposed to irony through an audio-visual format, and which students were ready to examine irony in text. Finally, in both instructional groups, my instruction made explicit connections between examples of irony in literature and media and examples of irony in real life. This aspect of the lesson was intended to benefit students who exhibit asynchronous development, where their intellectual skills have surpassed the development of some of their social skills. Standard 1.2 stipulates that gifted education professionals understand how language, culture, economic status, family background, and/or area of disability can influence the learning of individuals with gifts and talents. Again, my differentiated lesson plan demonstrates the implementation of this standard in my teaching practice. On both of the assessments and the instructional materials, the examples of irony come from a wide variety of cultural contexts. The students had access to both print and visual materials at school. Additionally, I chose my instructional materials with care. I did not want reading difficulties to be conflated with conceptual difficulties in my assessment data. Because irony is an abstract concept, I wanted to choose instructional materials that were at lower levels of reading complexity. The Sedaris story is on grade level, but the Sesame Street episode is obviously intended for much younger students. Using these materials ensured that I was assessing my students' understanding of irony, not their reading ability. I'd like to conclude my presentation with a reflection on learning. This applies to my students as well as to myself. In general, students who scored low on the pre-assessment scored higher on the post-assessment. Students who scored high on the pre-assessment maintained high scores on the post-assessment. This tells me that overall, the instruction was effective. Students seemed to enjoy the humor in the instructional materials, and this made irony a less intimidating concept for them. However, very few students took advantage of the online resources on Schoology. If I use the same lesson next year, I think that offering extra credit for viewing the materials and participating in the discussion board would be an incentive for students to access these resources. My references can be seen on this final slide. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I look forward to sharing the rest of my portfolio with you.